All right, let's talk about our expression of the day. So this expression, I actually heard, I was watching TV, I think last week, and I heard this expression, and I thought this might be a good one to talk about. So the name of this expression here, the expression is titled, Let Sleeping Dogs Lie. All right, everyone, you say that. Let sleeping dogs lie. Now, this expression basically means don't go looking for trouble because you might find it. So the basic idea is if you see a dog that's sleeping, don't bother it, right? Because if you try to awaken the dog, it might bite you. Now, we use this expression often when we are discussing topics that people don't like to talk about. So if you look at my picture over here, you see the dog sleeping, and this says do not disturb. Well, so for example, somebody might be asking about your age. So someone might get kind of irritated and say, look, don't ask me about my age, okay? Just let sleeping dogs lie on that question, right? Like, don't bother me on that question. Don't go looking for trouble with that question. Now, this brings up an interesting point. Since we have students from different cultures and different backgrounds, and again, when we move to another country, it's often hard to know which topics or things are kind of sensitive. Which things do we don't want to talk about? So maybe in our culture, or maybe even personally, there are certain things we don't like to discuss. So guys, here's our chat question of the day. So what's a sensitive topic or area that people often don't like to talk about? Are there specific things that people don't talk about in your country or culture? So give your answer in the chat box, or you can use the microphone, but let's think for a moment. What are some topics that people don't like to talk about? And like I said, you can think about maybe in your country, or maybe just in general. So for example, we mentioned people often don't like to talk about their age. Right, that's often a topic people are sensitive about. But let's take a moment. I'm going to bring up the chat box again. So everyone, if you want, you can use your mic or you can use the chat box. Tell us, what do you think are topics that people are sensitive about? Okay. Okay, so once again, guys, our new expression for the day, let's say it together one more time. Let sleeping dogs lie. So if you notice in my example here, we often use the word just, just let sleeping dogs lie. Don't talk about that topic. Don't bother that particular situation. So there's our new expression for the day. Once again, what I'd like to do this morning, just very quickly, and I know this is going to be a lot of information. Maybe you've heard me talk about this before, but part of the problem that students have is trying to understand how English stress works and why we have these longer sounds and we have these shorter sounds. So I'm going to take just a moment. So please try to follow me here for the next couple of minutes to just kind of give a little bit of just a small bit of history as to why English is like this. So I'm going to kind of go through this pretty quickly. So many of the reductions in English are words that are frequently used. So again, words like for and to, okay? Unfortunately though, these are words that students frequently miss or they misunderstand when we hear them in spoken form. So that's the thing we talked about last week. The spoken form of something is often going to be different from how it looks, okay? Now, as we discussed last week, English is a language based on rhythm. So that's very different from many of your languages. So again, English is based on a particular idea of rhythm and not necessarily on sound or specific placement of stress. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, for example, in our group here this morning, we have a couple of few different languages. But for example, if you compare English to, again, I'll use Spanish as my first example. In Spanish, every vowel sound is approximately the same length. So they're all basically the same length of sound. And then in Spanish, we normally stress words on the second to last syllable. So when I was learning Spanish, I had to learn that we would stress in most of the time in the same place. So again, that particular rule is what we call a stress timed rule. But the truth is English is not a stress timed rule. English does not often follow one rule for every word or every sound. Now, when we think about in Japanese, so again, I don't really speak Japanese, but in Japanese, syllables, you probably notice, are not stressed at all, like they're stressed in English. And actually in Japanese, we use kind of a more sing-song or kind of a rising and falling intonation of sound when we want to indicate meaning. Now, again, English uses up and down sounds, but again, not the same way that you would use them in a language like Japanese. Now, English has sort of a similar historical root with German. So, for example, in German, usually the first syllable of the root word is stressed. So when German builds words, they usually stress that first syllable. But then, of course, if we add to the word, then the stress might change. But again, part of the issue here is that German has a particular rule as to where we would stress for many of those root words. So as you can see, English is very different from these three languages, and again, from just about every other language when it comes to how we stress. Now, the question is, where did this come from? Well, again, I just want you to think for just a moment, because many of you have noticed already, English has lots of short words, English has lots of long words, but the truth is these words all came from different places. So what I want you to think about here this morning is English is not as consistent with its stress rules. Other languages like Spanish have a lot of consistency. But one problem of English, and you've heard me talk about this before, is that English is not a language that comes from just one place. So remember, when English began, it began with a different sort of family of languages. We called it the Germanic family. Now, as I told you before, English and German, long time ago, shared kind of this similar beginning. But of course, they both went in very different directions. But for example, in the beginning, many English words were often very short. And when they made changes to words, today we kind of add things to words, but many of the words in this early form of English would change internally. So we would call that inside of the word. Now, guys, you still see that today in some of the irregular words of English. So for example, remember the word see? Yeah, so again, this word see, if you go back and look at the history of this word, it is a word of Germanic origin, and it began back in the 10th century. So that's, again, a long time ago. Now, when we see when we change the word into the past tense, you probably notice we changed it to saw, right? See, saw. But we don't say seed, right? We don't put ed at the end of the word. Well, that's because many of those older words would change the letters. They would not add ed, they would change the letters. So for example, in Old English, and again, this was the English spoken, again, probably about 1,000 years ago or so, the original word, I'm going to try to pronounce it. I don't speak Old English, but probably the pronunciation, let's see if I can move that there. Yes, so the original pronunciation was seon, and when you changed it to the past, it was probably pronounced sea. So if you notice, the pronunciation has changed a lot too. But if you notice, we really only changed a couple of letters in that old English. And then eventually when the word continued to change, we kept some characteristic. So in this case, see became saw. So again, you probably notice we have lots of those irregular words in English. And your question is why? Why does English have so many crazy ideas? So guys, what I want you to think about here this morning is over time, English began to be influenced by many other languages. So over time, you had Greek, Latin, and especially French. Now, if you see the map, England and France are pretty much right next to each other. So their histories were very much connected. And these languages, Greek, Latin, and French, they all had more consistent stress patterns, but they had different sounds and, of course, different grammar systems. So when these languages came into English, they changed English in two very important ways. So those two ways you'll see here. So for example, as English began to be influenced by these languages, the vowel sounds of English, so again, the A and E and I, those sounds didn't really exist, at least not exactly in the way we pronounce them today. So what happened was, as more of these languages came into English, they changed the way vowels sounded. So for example, in Old English, most of the vowels were pretty short. They were pretty short in length. But when we started adding many of these new words between about the 1400s and 1600s, and actually it was longer than that, English added many new vowel sounds to its language. So what happened was the sounds of English, some of those sounds became longer in sound. So this not only affected the vocabulary of English, as we would call it the lexical development, but it also affected how people began to pronounce not only the new words, but also the older words. So notice when we said see, today we say see, but in Old English it was pronounced very differently. So again, this changed how we pronounced existing words too. Now, if we think about that first change, well, guess what? This is what eventually happened. Eventually in English, instead of just the sounds, we used rhythm to help kind of emphasize how we spoke. Again, Old English, rhythm was very different. All the words were kind of similar, in terms of just length. So eventually, some people believe that rhythm became more important. So now we have these different vowel sounds, and this affected how people would emphasize parts of the words. So we saw that last week when we think about long and short, the stressed, remember super would be emphasized. So what happened in English is, in order to preserve the longer sounds, it became easier and eventually more necessary to shorten the sounds, the other sounds of a word. Now, guys, if you can imagine, again, this is a long time ago. So this is before the internet, before TV, even before really a lot of people knew how to write or read. I mean, yes, writing and reading is a very old thing, but many people in England at the time were not very educated. So one problem is people would often learn words and they would learn how to say them, but they may never know how to actually write them. So as you can see, that was very confusing. So eventually, people had to develop a consistent way of communicating with each other. England was a lot of these smaller communities, these smaller groups that were eventually united by language, but not at the beginning. So eventually, English would develop these basic rules of stress. So, for example, the important sounds of English would be longer. And then what happened, if you remember last week, we would take the sounds that are not so important and we would make them shorter. So guys, here's the big question. So the result of these changes, what happened? Well, guess what? Spelling got weird. Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry. I misspelled the word weird there. I'm sorry. Let me try that again. Spelling got weird. Now, of course, that's a joke, but the idea is that's the problem. You see, when you change the pronunciation, but you don't necessarily change all of the writing, or at least you can't agree on the writing, this is where so many students get confused, because the spelling of English often does not look like the pronunciation of English. So the result of these changes and additions made English an incredibly difficult language to learn how to spell. Okay, so I think most of you know that now, and it's difficult for English speakers too. Many different communities across England could not agree on how these words would appear in written form. Now, eventually they did, but for example, many of those older English words, they already had spellings. For example, the word night. Now, that was not how they pronounced it many years ago. They would pronounce it as nicht. So as you can see, the problem here is we knew how to spell it, but the pronunciation changed. So what happened is the pronunciation shifted to a longer sound. So instead of saying nicht, they eventually would say I, night. Well, now that the vowel became more important, the consonant sounds would often change too. And in fact, that's where English gets many of its silent letters. For example, in the word night, notice that G and H we don't pronounce. That's what happened. Okay, so what happened is the vowels became longer and more important. The other sounds would become less important. And in fact, the other vowels would change so that we could keep this kind of rhythmic difference. And like we said before, even though reading and writing was beginning long before the 1400s, the truth is many people still weren't educated. So they didn't know what the words looked like when they were trying to learn them. Okay, so because English already had many words with specific spellings, rather than change the spelling, people just changed their pronunciation. So that's why English spelling and writing are often very different. And that's part of the problem we're talking about here today. So longer vowels would become easier to hear. Shorter vowels would be reduced. So that's what we learned last week, is many of those words like to, which sounds longer, but when we put it together in a sentence, it would reduce to a shorter sound. So what happened is, over time, then we started developing a consistency as to how all of these reduced vowels were going to sound. And that's where we're going to kind of begin here with a little discussion. And that is the schwa sound. Now, I introduced this in the video last week. Everyone say that with me, schwa. Okay? So the schwa sound is represented by this little symbol. So that symbol you saw last week was used in lots of the words, and we're going to practice that in just a moment. So in our discussion about reductions and reduced language, we're going to talk about that schwa. Now, the schwa sound is the shortest sound in English. We use this to replace vowel sounds in a word to make it shorter to pronounce. Now, in phonetic spelling, remember this is talking about how we pronounce it, it's represented by that upside down E. It looks like this here, okay? But the pronunciation of it is very short. Everyone, you try it. So notice it's a very short sound, and we use those. So last week you learned in those reductions that schwa sound can be found in many of the words that we frequently speak. So for example, words like and for and to and have, we use the schwa to help reduce those sounds. So for example, instead of saying for, which would be a longer sound, we would say fur. Instead of saying to, we reduced it to say to. So we use the schwa a lot, okay? Now, in this little activity, we're going to do this next activity together. So we're going to use our mics for this next activity, okay? So everybody, we're going to need our microphones turned on. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment. And I'm going to bring up here on the screen, I'm going to share this with you. This is a little practice just to kind of review what we were talking about. And let me zoom in just a little bit. So can everyone see that on the screen? It says de-emphasizing structure words. Maybe you can see that. Okay. All right, I'll move this over here. Okay. So again, in this particular activity, this is just kind of reviewing a little bit stuff we talked about last week. So, but if you can see here on the screen, it says, for example, let's see if I can hide the sidebar. All right, there we go. And maybe a little bigger. Oop, too big. Okay. All right. So, for example, many of these particular words we were practicing with use the schwa sound, right? So, again, remember last week we learned a lot of these words. So, again, we're going to use our mics here in just a moment, because what I want you to do is I want you to practice these, and I want to hear how we're using. But again, notice remember the words a and or, we shorten them to sound. Okay, so for example, I'm going to say the first sentence, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you guys to try these 4 sentences, not with me, but instead you're going to read them to me. So again, first, everyone, just listen. Okay, just listen first. All right. So for example, just listen. He takes a bus to work. Now notice takes a, right? Remember the linking, but notice is going to be reduced to that schwa sound. And instead of saying to, we're going to say to. He takes a bus to work. Okay. All right. Now, what we're going to do here is for number 1, 2, 3, and 4, I'm going to say them first. So again, just listen. And then I'm going to ask each student to read those 4 sentences to me. Okay. So I'm going to read number 1 again. He takes a bus to work. Okay. Listen, just listen. Number 2, they wrote a letter to the president. Number 3, I left an umbrella in your car. Number 4, she runs or swims every day. Okay. Now, again, look on the right side. Let's just look at those words again. Look at those linking in that schwa. Takes a, to, wrote a, to the, left an umbrella, your car, your. See how it's reducing that sound? Runs or swims every day. Okay. Now this week, what you're going to be learning is other ways to reduce. So you are going to be practicing with the SCHWA with the videos this week, but there are other ways that we can shorten speech. Now, last week we talked about linking, so I'm not going to review that here today. But again, linking is one way to make speech shorter because we use it to shorten the time, the rhythmic time. So as we said before, linking is how we can make the words when it sound as fast as minute, right? So try it, minute, when it. So linking helps, and again, to help reduce speech. So that's already one way we talked about last week. Now, another thing we talked a little bit about were elisions. Now, elision is basically just a big way of saying cutting. So it means to cut a specific sound. So we either cut a consonant or a vowel sound. Now, this is not the same as a silent consonant. A silent consonant is not pronounced at all. An elision, on the other hand, is something we do when speaking, not when writing. So in this case, we already talked about one example, and that was the disappearing H. So we can cut the consonant H sound, so like give her becomes giver. We can also, like the word of, so we talked about this last week, we can cut the F in the word of, and then we can also replace the vowel with the schwa, So in this case, instead of saying of, we said right? So for example, instead of a cup of coffee, we would say a cup of coffee. So in this case, that's another example of an elision, and you'll practice with a few more in the videos this week. Now, another way, of course, to shorten speech is to use contractions. So contractions are similar. We often link and cut with contractions too, but contraction is kind of its own idea in English. So again, we use them by removing letters and using punctuation. So for example, he is becomes he's. And we reduce by removing the I, we cut the I, and we replace it with that apostrophe. And again, you're going to practice more with contractions in one of this week's videos. Okay? Now, finally, extreme reductions. Some of you, we've already talked about these in class before, but an extreme reduction is when we take a lot of those phrases that we use all the time and we really kind of, smash them together, push them together to make them sound very fast. So, for example, look at the examples here on the screen. So I got wanna, gonna, have to, and then finally, what'ya or whatcha. So for example, wanna, you might know as want to, right? Gonna, going to, have to, and then finally, the last one is a really crazy one. What are you? Yeah, so let me talk about this last one very quickly. So for example, with what'ya and whatcha, follow how it kind of progresses here. So for example, what are you? Well, one thing we can do is we can contract, right? So there's a contraction there. What are you? Okay, so you guys try that. What are you? But then notice what happens is then the T starts to change sound. Instead of saying what, because we're linking, now it sounds like that D sound. Water, with the D sound. So some of you, again, I've talked about this in different classes, but this might be new for many of you. This is what's called the flap T. Basically, we hear this in North American English. So that's what happens when we have that T sound. It sounds like a D, what. So instead of saying what, we say wudda, wudder. Okay? So, but in British English, we don't use that. Now, the last two, the R and the U, well, remember, these are both common words, so we can reduce them using the schwa sound. So instead of saying or you, then we can just replace them with what'ya. Now you try it, everybody. What'ya. Yeah, it's crazy, right? You can also reduce by cutting even more. So for example, instead of using the D, you can put the D, the T, and the Y together. So for example, that's what happens when we get whatcha. So instead of saying what'ya, some people say whatcha. For example, what you doing? Yeah, what are you doing? So this is what's called assimilation. Now you're going to learn more about that in this week's videos too. So for example, when the T and the Y come together, very quickly, they kind of sound like the ch sound. what ya, what ya, what ya, what ya, what ya, what ya, what ya. It's a lot easier to combine them. So again, English has lots of these crazy situations. We can also use it with the D and the Y sound. So this is another example of assimilation. So for example, did you, okay, everyone you try it. Did you, well, of course we can reduce you to ya, right? Did ya. But because the D and the Y, when they come together very quickly, they sound a lot like the J sound. So for example, instead of saying did ya, some people say did ya, did ya. You try it. Did ya? Yeah. Did you have dinner? Did you? Did you? So again, anytime you have that D and the Y together, this is another example of assimilation. Okay, guys, so in this week's videos, you're going to review all of these different ways to reduce. You're going to see videos on the SCHWA, on elisions, okay, how to cut sounds, contractions, and then finally, you're going to see about those extreme reductions like wanna and gonna and so on, okay? All right. Well, guys, our time is up for today. I will post the next assignment in the Google Classroom here probably this afternoon. So again, your homework for next time is to watch the short videos on reduced speech. You'll see them in the assignment. And there's another listening activity I want you to practice. Now, this one's a little bit longer, so I'm giving you until next Friday, April 17th. Okay, so next Friday, April 17th, that's when you need to finish these activities. So you've got about 10 days or so.